If you're wondering which of the many Wan 2.2 model variants to use, curious about the real-world video comparisons between them, or even the raw generation speed of different GPUs, then this video is for you. I've taken the Wan 2.2, 5B, 14B FP8, 14B FP16, and 14B GUFF Q2 to Q8 models, and run a whole series of video generation comparison tests with them. I've run tests for both text-to-video and image-to-video, different text encoders, video resolutions, frame rates, as well as a raw speed test for different GPUs. I've used consistent settings for tests to try to produce like-for-like comparison results. However, where I did a straight-up comparison between the 5B and 14B models, I stuck with their recommended frame rates of 24 FPS and 16 FPS respectively. The results are not absolute, and tweaking settings for specific generations can certainly improve their individual result, especially the number of steps and the choice of sampler. I didn't cherry-pick, alter, or try to improve upon the initial video generations, so that you can see the real-world first-run results, which include the good, the bad, the ugly, and all my prompting mistakes. I ran all generations using my custom base Wan 2.2 workflows, which are based on the default workflows without any speed-improving modifications, nodes, or LoRa's added. Apart from the first GPU speed test comparison, all other comparison generations were run using an RTX 5090 with 32 GB of VRAM and 192 GB of RAM. For your own specific hardware, you can adjust the generation times accordingly. Since I'm terrible at prompting, I took inspiration for many of the prompts that I used from the excellent Wan 2.2 prompt crafting blog post from Mimic PC. It's certainly worth a read if you want to improve your Wan 2.2 prompting and focus in on the new capabilities that Wan 2.2 offers. I tried to use both input images and text prompts that tested these new Wan 2.2 capabilities. There are 11 video generation comparisons in total, to mainly focus in on comparing video generation quality, generation times, and prompt adherence. There's a number of interesting revelations across different comparisons that even surprised me. I'll leave all the references, links, and timestamps to each comparison test that I cover in this video in the description below. The first comparison test is a little different from all the others. I wanted to know which of the selected GPUs had the fastest raw generation speed. I know many of you are currently thinking about upgrading your GPU to a 50 series card. Although GPU VRAM size is still king and will determine which size models you can even use, it's the internal card architecture and technical specs that will determine its raw power and speed. I used the Wan 2.2 5B 10 GB model for this test, as it fitted comfortably into the VRAM of all test GPUs to try to eliminate the influence of VRAM size differences. All other settings remain the same for all generations. The image-to-video generations that you can see on the left are the resulting videos. Each test GPU was used to generate a number of these videos, and their average generation time calculated and shown in the table. I knew that the RTX 5090 would produce the fastest generations, but it's interesting to see how far ahead of the other GPUs it is. Looking at the 16 GB cards, I'm impressed at how much faster the 5070 Ti is over the 5060 Ti, and can now understand a bit better why the 5070 costs so much more than the 5060. It's nice to see the RTX 4090 continuing to hold its ground against 50 series cards. The 30 series cards are really starting to struggle with the newer models. Okay, let's move on to the next comparison. The second comparison is a straight-up text-to-video test of the four main Wan 2.2 model variants, the 5B, GUFF Q4, FP8, and FP16 models. I wanted to know the difference between these four models in terms of video generation quality, generation times, and prompt adherence. On the screen, you can see the text prompt that I used, as well as the test settings and results. Unsurprisingly, the 5B is super fast, but it's interesting how close the generation times are for all the 14B models, especially considering the huge difference in size between them. Let's take a look at the actual generations. All the videos seem to have too much water splash compared to the amount of water in the puddle. As you'd expect, the 5B model produced the lowest quality result and contains a number of distortions and artifacts. It also does the worst in terms of following the text prompt. Its video composition is very different from the 14B models, which are all very similar to each other. All the 14B models are very similar in terms of high-quality results, with no noticeable distortions or artifacts. Although they all produce garbage for the text on the ball, they all do really well in following the text prompt pretty much exactly. For the best overall balanced video in terms of quality, prompt adherence, and overall realism, I'd have to say the FP8 result wins it for me, but it's pretty close between all the 14B models. Okay, let's move on to the next comparison. The third comparison is a repeat of the previous straight-up text-to-video test of the four main Wan 2.2 model variants. Since the 14B results in the previous comparison were so close, I wanted to repeat the test using a different text prompt. On the screen, you can see the text prompt that I used, as well as the test settings and results. The generation times are all pretty similar to the previous comparison in terms of speed, although the GUFF and FP16 models took slightly longer this time, but the 5B and FP8 models have the exact same generation times. Let's take a look at the actual generations. Again, the 5B model has a very different video composition to the 14B models, which are all similar to each other. The 5B model is much lower in terms of video quality, with significant deformations and artifacts. Faces and buildings are just not correct or clear. A building morphs out of nowhere, and the model's having a hard time getting the people to walk or ride their bikes correctly. The girl sitting down on the floor looks like the bottom half of her body just hangs unnaturally behind her. All the text is just garbage. The 5B model followed the main instructions of the text prompt, but didn't include the smaller details of the girl's expression. The GUFF model starts off pretty good, but then descends into a fair amount of distortion with the mum and smaller child in the background. Text again is garbage, but it followed the text prompt very well. The FP8 model is spoilt by the distortions of the departing people at the start of the video, but then improves. Again, text is garbage, but it did follow the text prompt very well, although the girl looks too happy considering she's lost. The FP16 has no noticeable distortions, but the text is still garbage. I particularly like the girl's worried face, which aligns well with the fact that she's lost in New York. For the best overall balanced video in terms of quality, prompt adherence, and overall realism, the choice is much more obvious than the previous comparison test. The FP16 video is the clear winner. Okay, let's move on to the next comparison. The fourth comparison is again a test of the four main Wan 2.2 model variants, but this time using an image-to-video prompt. Like with the previous two text-to-image comparisons of these same models, I wanted to know the difference in terms of video generation quality, generation times, and prompt adherence, but this time using an input image as well. On the screen, you can see the input image and text prompt that I used, as well as the test settings and results. All the models took a couple of seconds longer for this image-to-video generation compared to their text-to-video generation times. Again, the 5B model was super fast, with the 14B models roughly in the same ballpark as each other. Let's take a look at the actual generations. I envisioned the man just stomping his foot hard in the puddle, but in all generations he ended up unrealistically disappearing into a deep water hole. However, looking back at my text prompt, I really could have made it more clear, so I'll give the models the benefit of the doubt. Let's start with the 5B model. The overall look of quality is much better using an image prompt rather than a text-only prompt, allowing the model to just modify the specific areas that I prompted it to. However, it did a pretty poor job for the action, with the man's body basically collapsing apart on entering the water. It looks more like something out of the Matrix, which was not what I was going for. Apart from that pretty significant issue, the rest of the action is actually pretty good. Overall, the 5B model did follow the text prompt pretty well, even down to the multicolored water splash, although the color vibrancy of the splash is a lot more washed out than some of the 14B models. The GUFF model did a very good job in terms of overall quality and following the text prompt. There's a few unnatural motions with the man's limbs, but nothing too excessive. There's nice coloring in the water splash. The FP8 model has a few more unnatural, funky things happening with the man's limbs than the GUFF model, and there's just no color in the water splash, although it did follow the text prompt very well. The FP16 model is disappointing. The movement of the man's limbs are just not right, and his leg seems to just collapse. Right at the end, after the splash, his face is just a distorted blob. To its credit, unlike the other results, his hat does look soaking wet after. The color of the water splash is equally as good as the GUFF model, and the text prompt was followed very well. For the best overall balanced video in terms of quality, prompt adherence, and overall realism, for me, the GUFF video result wins. Okay, let's move on to the next comparison. The fifth comparison is a repeat of the previous image-to-video test of the four main Wan 2.2 model variants. I wanted to repeat the test, but this time using a close-up input image and more subtle movement text prompt to see if these changes influenced model outcomes. On the screen, you can see the input image and text prompt that I used, as well as the test settings and results. Each of the models took pretty much the same generation times as the previous image-to-video comparison test. Let's take a look at the actual generations. The overall quality of the 5B video is pretty decent to look at, more in line with the 14B compositions this time, but perhaps too much camera zoom. Although it mainly followed the prompt, it's not to the levels of intensity that I asked for. The zombie's eyes don't turn intensely red, his mouth expression doesn't intensify, and blood flows from his nose hole and not just his teeth. His final expression seems to be more of a smile rather than scary. The 14B models are all of a high standard and followed the small specifics of the text prompt very well indeed. I don't like the transitions of the eyes to red in the FP8 or FP16 models, with the GUFF model much more seamless. The blood on the FP16 is a little too much spurt rather than drip. All the 14B models are pretty close though. Again, for the best overall balanced video in terms of quality, prompt adherence, and overall realism, for me, the GUFF video result wins, although the FP8 is pretty close. Okay, let's move on to the next comparison. The sixth comparison is a text-to-video test of the 5B and GUFF Q4 models using different text encoders. The FP16 text encoder is about 5 GB in size, bigger than the FP8, so I wanted to know whether it's even worth using the FP16 and whether generation times would be longer. On the screen, you can see the text prompt that I used, as well as the test settings and results. The FP16 text encoder took just a couple of seconds longer than using the FP8, so there's no difference to worry about there. It all now just comes down to quality and prompt following. Let's take a look at the actual generations. For both 5B results in the top row, I think both are pretty bad. Unrealistic, oversaturated, 3 donkeys instead of 2, lack of clarity, deformations going on all over the place, and I have no idea why she keeps touching her hair and trying to pick flowers. Anyway, this test is not about the flaws, but really about whether the FP16 text encoder on the right produced a better result than the FP8 on the left. I just can't see any obvious differences, apart from the FP16 on the right producing an overall happier girl, although with more hand deformations. Moving on to the GUFF Q4 model in the bottom row. Overall, both are vastly better than the 5B videos. They followed the prompt very well indeed, and everything just looks a lot more realistic. As for the text encoder differences, nothing obvious jumps out, although again the girl is a lot happier with more movement with the FP16 text encoder. I was sure the FP16 text encoder was going to give a noticeable boost over the FP8, even if just in the level of details like you see with Flux image generations. I actually ran 2 additional sets of comparisons that I didn't include in this video, using very different text-to-video prompts, and the results were pretty much the same, no noticeable differences. So my conclusion is that I can't see any reason to use the bigger and slower FP16 text encoder over the FP8 with these models. Okay, let's move on to the next comparison. The seventh comparison is a repeat of the previous text-to-video test using different text encoders, but this time comparing them on the FP8 and FP16 models, again to see if the FP8 and FP16 text encoders would influence model outcomes. On the screen, you can see the text prompt that I used, as well as the test settings and results. Again, there are negligible generation time differences using the different text encoders with the same model, although the FP16 text encoder times are strangely a few seconds faster than those using the FP8. Let's take a look at the actual generations. All the resulting videos are very good indeed and followed the text prompt incredibly well, which was actually very detailed and specific across a range of different camera actions and lighting conditions. The only flaw that stood out is the FP8 model with the FP16 text encoder in the top right, incorrectly having a female archer instead of a male archer as implied in the prompt. As for the differences across the different text encoders, I really can't see anything. So my conclusion again is that I can't see any reason to use the bigger and slower FP16 text encoder over the FP8 with these models. Okay, let's move on to the next comparison. The eighth comparison is a straight-up text-to-video test of the popular GUFF Wan 2.2 model variants. The Q2, Q3, Q4, Q5, Q6, and Q8 models. I wanted to know the real difference between these 6 models in terms of video generation quality, generation times, and prompt adherence. On the screen, you can see the text prompt that I used, as well as the test settings and results. It's surprising how the generation times for all GUFF models are pretty similar, especially considering how much smaller the Q2 at 5.3 GB is to the Q8 at 15.4 GB. Let's take a look at the actual generations. The differences don't really pop out with the dark atmosphere. I should really have prompted for a brighter environment. Since all GUFF models are based on the Wan 2.2 14B base model, all the compositions are very similar, except for the positioning of the fireplace, which to be fair, I didn't specifically prompt for it to be shown in the shot. They all followed the text prompt very well, with some models a bit better than others. The Q2 model does surprisingly well considering its size. It even has the fireplace fully in the shot. It does lack quality though. There's several areas of distortion in the movement areas, and it misses out many of the smaller details like steam rising from the cups, of which there are 3 instead of the expected 2. Overall, I think it may in fact do better than the 5B model at nearly twice its size, although the Q models take significantly longer than the 5B model. There seems to be a noticeable step up across the board from Q2 to Q3. It looks much more realistic, has a full-shot fireplace, and there are minimal distortions or artifacts. The Q4, which is my regular go-to GUFF model, produces an overall better result than the Q3, but doesn't have the fireplace fully in view. Not sure why the Q4 models always seem to produce younger-looking people than the others. Maybe it's a Q4 trait. The Q5 does produce some additional clarity and finer details than the Q4, which is also the case as you move from Q5 to Q6 and Q6 to Q8. Overall, for the best balanced video in terms of quality, prompt adherence, and overall realism, for me the GUFF Q8 video result wins, although the Q6 was pretty close. The takeaway, considering generation times are so similar with all GUFF models, is to use the highest Q model that can fit in your GPU VRAM. Okay, let's move on to the next comparison. The ninth comparison is an image-to-video test of using only the 5B model, and testing it with 720p and 480p resolutions, as well as 24 and 16 frame rates with both resolutions. The 5B model supports only 720p, and the recommended settings are 1280 by 704 with 24 FPS. There's many people advocating generating really low resolution and low frame rate videos with Wan 2.2, and then upscaling and using frame interpolation to bump up the video's resolution and smoothness afterwards, since the post-video processing work is quicker and less GPU demanding than trying to output that higher level from Wan 2.2 initially. On the surface, especially if you have a mid to lower end GPU, this would seem to make absolute sense. So I wanted to know what the actual generation time differences would be, using different resolutions and frame rates, and more importantly, whether there would be any significant difference in actual video result by making these changes. On the screen, you can see the input image and text prompt that I used, as well as the test settings and results. As expected, moving down in resolution or frames, or both resolution and frames, produced significantly faster generations. However, the increased speed is not linear. Breaking down the overall generation times to a per-frame generation speed shows that as you lower the resolution or frame rate, you actually get a disproportionately faster generation. So going lower gives you an added speed bump. Let's take a look at the actual generations. If we first look at the top row with the 720p resolution, both videos do really well in terms of following the prompt and in the quality that they produce. They both handle the sunlight flowing through the trees well. The 24 FPS video on the left is let down by his eyes suddenly becoming misaligned at the end, but does well in conveying his overall excitement. The 16 FPS on the right is pretty solid though. It really depends on the look you prefer, so nothing really negative at 720p resolution by moving down in frame rate. If we move to the 480p resolutions in the bottom row, things become a bit disturbing pretty quickly. In the 24 FPS on the left, he seems to have more of a crazy, rather than an excited way about him. Not really the look or feel I was going for. As we move to the right and drop down to 16 FPS, the level of insanity just jumps to a whole new level. He's clearly gone from excited to losing the plot completely, and the neon lighting effects just add to the disturbing scene. Neither of these lower resolution videos handle the sunlight flowing through the trees well at all. There's also a lot of light flickering, but that could be due to the Uni-PC sampler I used. It's fast, but does sometimes cause flickering. There are also a lot of deformations and artifacts, so not good results by moving down in resolution. So in conclusion, although lower resolutions do give much faster generation times, they produce a vastly inferior video compared with their higher resolution equivalents, which are not worth using to go through additional upscaling. Dropping frame rates may be a viable option though, especially if it produces a decent video, and you're either happy with the smoothness or willing to add additional frames. Okay, let's move on to the next comparison. The 10th comparison is a repeat of the previous test, but this time using the GUFF Q4 model with text-to-video. I used the most popular 14B resolutions of 720p, 480p, and 360p, as well as 24 and 16 frame rates. The 14B models support 720p and 480p, and the recommended frame rate is 16 FPS. I wanted to see if a change in resolution and frame rate also has the same impact on speed and results as the 5B in the previous test, but this time using a popular 14B model. On the screen, you can see the text prompt that I used, as well as the test settings and results. Again, we can see a significant increase in generation speed as we lower resolutions and frame rates. Let's take a look at the actual generations. If we first look at the 720p videos in the top row, both are actually pretty decent. The one on the left at 24 FPS is overall better in terms of quality, continuous flow of the dragon, and maneuvering around the buildings. There's only one flying car that I can spot, which is a bit disappointing. Apart from that, it followed the prompt very well. For the 16 FPS version on the right, the dragon just comes to an abrupt halt, which spoils the video. There are no flying cars at all, but apart from that, it followed the prompt well. Overall, the clarity, detailing, and creativity is better with the 24 FPS video on the left. If we move to the lower resolution videos on the bottom row, the 480p video on the left is actually pretty decent. It does the best out of them all, with including a number of flying cars in the scene. The details are good, and I would say, better than the 720p 16 FPS video in the top right. Certainly the details on the dragon are better and very good indeed. The only criticism is that the dragon doesn't maneuver around the buildings much. As you drop down to 360p in the bottom right, things deteriorate rapidly. Lack of details, uninteresting, no flying cars, wrong color, and blurred dragon. In conclusion, the sweet spot for speed and overall high-quality video that follows the prompt well seems to be the bottom left at 480p and 16 FPS. I'd probably stick with this, and then run the resulting video through an upscale and frame interpolation. Okay, let's move on to the next comparison. The 11th and final comparison is a straight-up text-to-video test of 4 of the most popular large 14B model variants: the FP8, FP16, GUFF Q6, and GUFF Q8 models. I wanted to know the difference between these models in terms of video generation quality, generation times, and prompt adherence, to determine which larger model should be the go-to if you have a GPU with 16 GB or more VRAM. Additionally, since the FP8, Q6, and Q8 models are roughly the same size, I wanted to know whether their video results are really significantly worse than the huge FP16 model. On the screen, you can see the text prompt that I used, as well as the test settings and results. In terms of generation speeds, there's really not that much between them. In fact, the twice as large 28.6 GB FP16 model takes only a couple of minutes more than the others. Let's take a look at the actual generations. Since all the videos are based on the 14B model, as expected, the compositions are very similar, so it's really the smaller details that will separate them. If we start with the FP8 video in the top left, the end result is pretty good. It has a couple of appropriate details that the other models don't. An outer pipe in front of the initial main pipe exit, which is a nice touch, and a snow-covered building roof. The only negatives are the hot air balloon looks more black than blue, the bottom of the balloon looks a bit deformed, there's smoke or steam coming out of the balloon instead of just the pipes on the ground, and the snow on the ground blurs and distorts as the camera moves up fast. Apart from these, it followed the text prompt pretty well. Moving on to the FP16 model in the top right, it pretty much nails it and followed the text prompt perfectly. There's a noticeable step up from the FP8 model in terms of quality and tiny small details. The sky lighting looks particularly good, and there's no real blurring or distortion of the snow on the ground throughout the shot. Everything is formed correctly, and although the balloon isn't blue, there is a blue stripe on it. Moving to the GUFF Q6 in the bottom left. Again, very good, but overall closer to the FP8 rather than the higher levels of the FP16. It's let down by the extra deformed CNG wording on the balloon. Other negative issues are very much in line with the FP8 ones. Black balloon, deformed bottom of the balloon, and the snow on the ground blurs and distorts as the camera moves up fast. Again, apart from these, it followed the text prompt pretty well. Moving over to the GUFF Q8 in the bottom right. As you'd expect, it's very much closer to the high quality of the FP16 rather than the FP8. In fact, it's really hard to see differences between the FP16 and the Q8, even after looking really closely in slow motion. Although when you do, at the start of the video, the detailing on the orange jackets of the people, the tanker, detailing on the building and the items around the building are much more defined in the Q8 video compared to the FP16. I would have expected more fine details with the FP16 model. Clearly, it followed the prompt extremely well. In conclusion, I would have to give the win to the GUFF Q8 in the bottom right, with the FP16 a close second. So for those of you with 16 GB of VRAM who just can't run the huge FP16 model, it looks like you're not missing out on too much. This is the final comparisons table and the winners that I chose for each based on my personal opinion. Anyway, hope you found this video helpful, and I'll catch you in the next one.